Good morning, West Coast. Good afternoon, East Coast. Good evening, UK, Holland, Germany. Australia's still sleeping. Quick shout out this morning to Lulu, Andre's cat, who I failed to give a shout out to last week. Lulu. And we're here for questions and answers this morning. How's everybody in the voice chat doing? A small group today. That's all right. Let's begin with Gavin. Gavin has a whole bunch of questions. They're sort of catechetical in nature. What happens when people have wrong views or beliefs? That depends on whether they act on them. Wrong views or beliefs tend to lead to difficult actions and behaviors. So, do you ever worry that your beliefs are wrong? Sure, all the time. That's part of what we're always doing. We're always checking and testing and trying to validate and see if what we're believing is wrong. Believing is all about this internal mapping that we do, and we use that map in order to go out into the world. Now, none of our maps are perfect. All of our maps are flawed and limited, but we are always map checking to check the territory around us and the internal map inside of us. It's kind of a good metaphor. Obviously it's not unique to me. Maps of meaning. Mapping has become sort of a buzz holy word. What is the goal of the Creator? Glory. What does the Creator want? Does the Creator want peace on earth? Well, peace in English is sort of an absence of conflict. And if you listen to Jesus in our men's Bible study, we're reading Matthew 11. Jesus says, I've not come to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. Well, what does he mean by that? Peugeot actually had a really nice video this week about transcendence and immanence, where he laid out something about reading the Bible and reading contradictory texts. And I thought that was really a fairly good treatment. The Creator, just look at the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In some ways, that answers your second little grouping of questions. How does the Creator accomplish this goal? Through his Spirit, through his Son, through his governance of the world, through the governors that he gives to the world for its governance. What is the relationship between the Creator and us? Well, I think the analogy that Jesus most often uses is father and son, or father and children. So the Creator is our Father, and we are God's children. And that's such a helpful metaphor, because unlike where our society has gone with suffering, I've watched a couple of Rationality Rules videos that I'm sorely tempted to make some response videos to. Not because I think necessarily he's getting a lot of things right. I think he's just articulating them wrong in a way that is so common that it's helpful to use him to hopefully get some things better. So God is our Father. What does that mean? When you think about a good father, and actually, I've been listening to a lot of Grim Grizz's videos, and I finally discovered Mark's channel. I kept going to this other channel that was Mark's, and it's like he said, watch my video. Where the heck is the video? Well, now I know where the videos are, so I'm really excited about that. And looks like Mark's doing some really good, unlike me, reasonably length videos to articulate some of his things. So I'll be hopefully spending some time on Mark's channel and spending some time on Grim Grizz's channel. But the Grim Grizz had a really good video of Mice and Men that he complained in one of his recent response videos to my recent videos that I hadn't watched. I had watched it, but I hadn't watched it thoughtfully enough, where he takes some of Paglia's conversation with Jordan Peterson, and that gets into this whole question of fatherhood, because we seem to Paglia and the classic mouse experiment that was done, and Grimm just cuts between those two things, and I thought he did it really nicely. And of course, he's always fun to watch, and he sings on his videos too, which I think is, just adds entertainment value to his videos. So definitely watch Grim Grizz. I'm dyslexic, so I get it wrong. Definitely watch his stuff. So the relationship between the Creator and us is father and children. How do you feel about judging people? Well, judging in English has a broad lexical range that trips us up. We have to discern other people, and we do so all the time. Now, there's a difference between discerning and condemning. And when Jesus says, do not condemn, he says, do not judge. That's usually how it's rendered in English translations. But the force of, I think, what Jesus is saying is do not condemn, because you're not a judge, unless you are a judge, at least within a framed earthly sphere. So don't condemn others, because you're not God, and only the righteous can condemn, and you're not righteous. So the measure that you use to condemn others will be used against you. At the same time, this mapping that we do about beliefs, we have to use judgment. We have to use discernment. And so we are given agency, we're given autonomy, and in this individualist culture, we have a great degree of responsibility to use our agency and our autonomy for the good. And so we have to discern. And part of how we discern is we watch other people make judgments and watch the consequences for it, good or bad, right or wrong, maybe good now and bad later. And that then leads us to discern and judge for ourselves what we should do. So we should always be discerning and trying to understand others, but condemning others, that's not really our job. So discern, critique, explain, but only God has finally the judge, and because only God can finally judge. Do you judge the person's willingness and ability to align with the Creator's goals? Well, I certainly discern that to whatever degree I can, but willingness and ability are really deal to a great degree with motivation and potential. Motivation is, even for myself, I'm not always sure exactly what my motivations are. And if there's anything that we've learned over the last 100 years with all of this depth psychology, it's that there are things going on beneath the surface that we are not necessarily aware of. And so then we sort of have these facsimile motivations or simulated motivations that we deal with. And so then that's really difficult in me. How on earth do we manage to do it with others? So we ought to be very careful about imagining an individual's motivation and ability. Ability involves potential. So we see someone's capacity and outcomes, and we certainly make discernment. We can't help but discern and evaluate. You notice I'm trying to avoid the word judging because of that duplex nature of the word. So we're always doing that. And we are impressed by some people, by their abilities, by their gifts, by their capacities. And we are sometimes disappointed by people. So we're always doing that. And whether or not we think that's good, bad, right, or wrong, it's simply going to be a human constant. And I think we have to do that in order to operate in this world. Do you care about competence hierarchies? Yes, we all do. Why do I? So I made my, who is Paul Vanderklay and what is he about on his YouTube channel video to do a little bit of explaining about this. Part of how I select videos to do commentary on and videos to engage with and individuals to engage with in the channel in my monologue and commentary videos is because I am discerning competencies in certain individuals. And part of what we do is we aspire, hopefully, to grow in our competency. And most of the time that means learning from or appropriating from other individuals who are doing it better. This, again, is a constant human thing. We start out doing this as children. We look at our parents and we appropriate so much of what they're doing. Now, a couple of years ago, I was playing around with some of those videos that were comparing children to chimpanzees. And it was very interesting the way children mimic as compared to chimpanzees. Children in some ways mimic the culture layer in ways that chimpanzees don't. And we might think that that is sort of that is a bug, but it's actually a feature, because we are never perfect at relevance realization, sort of John Vervaeke's compression of intelligence. We'll say it that way. So when we mimic and when we map on all sorts of things that later on we might decide are spandrels or excessive things or ornamentation or embroidery on what we imagine to be the essential thing that gets us the pellet or the candy or whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, a la competency, we don't recognize everything that goes into it. And that's why, for example, watch baseball or basketball or football. Baseball is slower than basketball and football, which sort of gives space to watch hitters and their, when they get up to the plate, they, adjust their wristband. I mean, baseball players are notoriously superstitious. So they've got this whole little ritual before they're set there in the box ready to swing. Pitchers have this whole little ritual in terms of this little dance before they throw. You see it more in basketball with free throws. They engage in a little ritual before they throw. Now you might say, well, that ritual is incidental. It's a spandrel. It's accidental to the act of the free throw. But what you discover, you see this in football with field goal kickers. They, on one hand, they measure out where they start from because they're trying to dial this in order to get precision. And you might think, well, those are extra things. Well, are they? If they do them, and in fact, they have a higher percentage, a higher batting average, they're a better pitcher, or they're a better field goal kicker, or they have a better free throw percentage, you're not going to argue with the little ritual that they do. There's something deeply analogous to religion there, because what happens with religious communities is that all kinds of things get passed on, and now someone using this intelligence compression engine of relevance realization might say, oh, we're going to strip away all of that religiosity and just get to the kernel. But the problem is you're not smart enough to know the kernel, so you're better off copying the entire ritual. And this gets into some of the, some of this parabolic knowledge. It's the whole, we need the whole parable because we're not smart enough. Our view of the world is not large enough to actually capture the kernel. And so then what we do is you'll often see competing rituals, and you'll say, well, this one is better than that one because we're looking at outcomes necessarily. But even with respect to outcomes, we don't know and this is often where we're fooled, we don't know even what the better outcomes are. We're not even sure on that. Now, with kicking field goals, it's getting it through the uprights. And with shooting free throws, it's getting it in the basket. And with hitting, it's hitting a home run. But life is not like that. And so there's all of this stuff that we go through, not only to try and achieve the outcomes we want, but hopefully to try and achieve the outcomes we need that we're not even smart enough to want. So, yes, I believe in competence hierarchies, but you have to understand that when it comes to human beings, we're not smart enough, we don't know enough, we're not good enough, and so there has to be a degree of fudge that we carry through the system, and that degree of fudge is not excess, it's not a bug, it's a feature. So whole bunch of questions from you, Gavin. I see you're in the room. I don't know if you can talk or not, so if you want to respond, go right ahead.
I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your thoughts. I thought it was interesting that you used the word Father, because that's the word Jesus would use often. And I had used the word Creator, and I think there's probably different roles. And you can think about God as a father, and a question might be, what does a good father want for their children? So right. Ideally, you would become something. But I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. All right. And any other responses to that little slug of questions I gave from the voice chat room?
I have a quick question. I was wondering about times when it's appropriate to kind of fight against the system, because you mentioned that that we really don't have the knowledge to know like what's good and what's bad, and you're just better off as a general rule fighting the system. But of course, there's those times when you have to fight the system, even if it's going to destroy you. And I think one of the famous examples of this is Socrates and his trial, right? So the system, the I guess legitimate system, like voted on his trial and sentenced him to death. But he offered a thanks sacrifice to the gods for his death. And in my view, I consider him right to do so, but I don't really know, like, in what sense I'm actually justified in doing that, right? Because I agree with your argument, but there's also these exceptions that kind of show that there's something else also going on. Thank you.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a great observation. And it's interesting that in the Bible, if you read the Psalms, there's a whole lot of complaining in the Psalms. Oh God, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far off? Why don't you listen to my prayers? Why do the wicked flourish? Why isn't my covenant righteousness working for me? And that's not scrubbed out of the Bible. It's not, sanitized. And again, one of my favorite passages, Genesis 18, where, Lord, certainly you wouldn't sweep away the just with the unjust, because, God decides to tell Abram what he's about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. And I mean, that entire relationship is phenomenal to watch. The same with God and Moses and the desert wanderings. They sort of take turns wanting to, delete Israel and start over as if they were playing Sim City or something. And the Bible is full of that. And what that leads us to believe is that God not only allows, but sometimes encourages us to push back. Now, read the book of Job. The entire book of Job is a pushback. And then God pushes back too. And, it's a little scary when God pushes back because it's not a fair fight. But you're right. There are times. And what's beautiful about the Socrates story is, and I think you framed it well, he still sacrifices to the gods. Well, what does that understand? It understands that almost every other culture except this atheist materialist one that we are living in framed their reality within a larger reality. And obviously, the larger reality the imagination of the larger reality continued to develop as time went on. Some of that is the difference between, let's say, Sheol or Hades in Greek and Hebrew, and then heaven and hell, and how afterlife gets conceptualized as things continue. So yeah, there are times to overthrow the system. And you look at, say, the American political thing. The founding fathers of the United States by no means were suffering under the kinds of things that, let's say, the Ukrainians that Stalin starved. They certainly had, I would say, a better reason to rise up and overthrow Stalin than the founding fathers had to kick out the king. But they did. And was it a good thing? Well, I think probably. So here we are. But that all gets into this question of agency. When should you, and we deal with that in small ways too. Maybe you're in a job that isn't a good job. When's it time to leave? Maybe you're in a marriage. That's a much bigger deal. Are there grounds for divorce? I think yes. Should they be, is that an extreme thing? Yes. That's sort of the Christian take. Divorce is sometimes better than staying, but it's an extreme position. And with almost every revolution, there are going to be downsides. So no, it's a great point. It's a great point. Okay, Prophet Zacharias. Reply to last week's response to Scott Adams. In some ways, Scott Adams is like an anti-Peugeot. Well, that's interesting. But maybe not for the reason you think. He's a rationalist and a materialist and goes further than Sam Harris where free will is concerned. He believes that we are totally deterministic. However, he has spent his life observing patterns through a materialist frame. His hypnotism and his persuasion techniques all come to his view on how the human mind works. Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good summary. I first encountered Adams. Well, I'd seen Dilbert before, of course, but I first decided to pay some attention to Adams after the Trump election because Adams was one of these guys that said, I called it. Oh, okay, good. Well, what else can we learn from you? Because if you got that right, maybe you're getting other things right. And so then I read his book on success, and I thought that was actually quite a good book. There's a lot of wisdom in that book. He is both kind of engaging to listen to, and I also sometimes find him kind of annoying. He's fairly hubristic in some ways. I can't stress enough how interesting his book Win Bigly is. Well, now you're really getting me interested. As if I need to buy more books. As if I am not surrounded by books I've only half read. But I don't know. It seems to be working for me. Quote, the simulated reality movie. In this movie, an earlier species created humans as some sort of computer simulation. We believe we are as real as our creators, but there are billions of simulations for every original species, assuming that every simulation eventually learns to create its own simulations and so on. So not only do we get the simulation theory, we get the multiverse theory. It's interesting. In this movie, a lot of computer programming code gets reused for the sake of efficiency, and that's why we see patterns in life where none should exist. In this Trump movie, we are seeing code reused. Well, that's very, very interesting. Now you've really teased me. And I really like the simulation theory because, as many have noted, it sort of is theism for atheist materialists. And what I mean by that, it sort of opens their imagination from what I find this stilted, constrained, dwarf imagination that I hear with so many celebrity atheists and new atheists. It just says, the options are much larger than you imagine. He said that in reference to the idea that he knew Trump would win because his candidacy went through a first act and second act, and after the leaked Billy Bush tape, it felt like a third act win for the hero. He accepts the three-act structure as built somehow into the fabric of the world in our minds. That's interesting. Where Peugeot would say this is a pattern that makes the world, Scott says in the book it could point to our being a simulation. I would also point to Appendix C in the book for more of his thoughts on this. I got to buy that book now. Dang it. I blow away my church book budget every year. Spend way too much money on books. But thank you for this. That's really cool. And more from the prophet Zacharias. Were you aware of the fact that one of Pete Thiel's mentors at Stanford was Rene Girard? Yes, I was. He uses Girard's theory of violence and scapegoating in his economic growth models and paints a negative picture of the future for the U.S. Chris Hedges told Matt Taibbi, I got to pay more attention to Taibbi. Somebody mentioned that recently, and they're right. And I like Chris Hedges, too. I've read some of his books. So I'm down for a conversation between Chris Hedge and Matt Taibbi. Part of my problem is that in the information age, so much of our problem is a filter problem. And again, this is why I need to be spending more time on the Discord, because you guys are a good filter. And a lot of what you're doing for each other is filtering. You're not only identifying new sources, but the relevance realization is both in the bringing in of new sources and which is also in many ways the filtering of those new sources. And people with their relevance realizations and all of the patterns that are built into them and all of the commonalities built into us between each other, that's what make people so much better filters rather than this YouTube algorithm, which is trying to be a filter for me with YouTube. And the more I use YouTube, in a sense, sort of like the Matrix, them watching those green characters flow down a screen, the more I see the algorithm at work. And every now and then the algorithm surprises me, but most of the time, the more I see it, the dumber it looks. And that's different from all of you, because you are, in fact, getting smarter faster than the algorithm. At least some of you are. So Chris Hedges told Matt Taibbi last week that this current culture, this current moment reminds him of what he saw in Yugoslavia just before and then during various ethnic and religious conflicts. I think that's true, that we definitely have conflict going on. Now, why that is salient to us is because we as human beings are violence attracts our attention. Conflict attracts our attention. Now, if you think like an evolutionary psychologist, it makes perfect sense, because if there's violence going around you, your body wants to avoid violence that would do you harm. Or maybe it's fight or flight. So you flee from violence if you can. If you can't flee from violence, then suddenly you figure out, what must I do violently? I mean, the violence is, of course, life and death in many ways here in meat space, in the Matterverse. But now so much of the conflict that's going on right now in our culture is in the storyverse. You have, in that way, our culture is deeply feminized, because we are much more doing reputational violence to each other rather than physical violence to each other. And I think in many ways that's an upgrade, but figuring out, again, the math on this kind of thing is far too large for us. So whereas we're definitely, we can look around at patterns of reputational violence and story versus conflict and say that has led to physical violence, and destruction. And we're exactly right. If you listen to two people who are, and you see this in marriages, if you look at a couple that is very unhappy and they're always fighting, the odds of there being physical violence between them is far greater than a couple that is getting along well and they're happy together. There's no question about that. But there are many couples that are always quarreling and they don't cross that line. And we don't even know all the reasons when they do and don't cross that line. I think sometimes the reason is we're all pretty pragmatic with respect to physical violence, or most of us are. And we don't go there unless we have nothing to lose. And we see this in our society too. I've heard it said that most of the people in prison basically get their, don't make minimum wage. I mean, they don't, if you're going to steal in this country, be a white collar criminal, no question about it. People in prison, it's in our culture, in many ways, physical violence is really dumb. And our culture is so affluent. And increasingly, what was I listening to where they were talking about? It was a Peterson thing. And it was his conversation with Rob Henderson, where, there's so much stuff. We're living in a culture that is so affluent when it comes to things. I wonder if that's just going to make the odds of civil war and physical violence less, because it's just easier to ignore each other. Now, we see violence in the streets sometimes and flare-ups, but even not at the levels. I started watching the Soprano prequel. Wasn't terribly impressed. Didn't have the kind of brilliance that I saw in The Sopranos when I first watched that years ago. But, one of the earlier scenes, they have the Newark riots in 1967. Our level of public violence right now, even after some of the stuff that we had in the wake of George Floyd, is a lot less than it was in the 60s and 70s. Now, see, part of the issue with this is there are so many factors. Because of the information economy, there's a reason we're increasingly suspicious of totalitarian government, both from the right and from the left, because part of what we've developed over the last 30 years are the most amazing tools to spy on each other in a very granular way. And of course, the Chinese are implementing this. So there's a lot going on. And just noticing levels of reputational violence and disharmony doesn't necessarily mean civil war will erupt. It's things, human societies are, if human beings are the most complex creatures that we're aware of, human societies are enormous hyper objects that are just complexity upon complexity upon complexity, that our ability to predict the future, it's really bad. So, yeah, he flat out believes that a civil war is coming. Okay, well, what kind of a civil war? What do you mean by civil war? Part of the reason that the American Civil War played out the way it did was there was a pretty significant geographic division, and there were already geopolitical entities, the states, that had militias that facilitated the nature of that war. So, yeah, I understand the concern, but I don't know. Douthit covers the problem of long-term stagnation in his book, The Decadent Society. So Grizz was just I was watching his Mice and Men. So then I was watching the source videos for that video about those mouse experiments in the post-World War II, the mouse utopias. They're such fascinating experiments. Why did those experiments stop, and why didn't those experiments yield what sometimes when we watch a video of them think they should have yielded? Well, because we are not mice. We are way, way more complex socially than mice. But this afternoon, I might do a response video to that video, because what that video in me triggered was an appreciation for just how limited our the awareness of our conscious cognition is, and just how limited this thing called rationality is. And some of that might get folded into my response to rationality rules. I approached him, and he and I had some offline conversations about maybe doing a video. I did that after the Peugeot video, because his conversation with Peugeot didn't go that well. And I was kind of curious to take a shot at it, because I thought it might go better between me, just because of who I am. And I don't say that to put myself in a hierarchy with Peugeot or Stephen Woodford, but he's raising common atheist points that I don't think are what he imagines they are in his videos. So he's just you have to look around in your environment for people to talk with, or to push back against, or to hold this up here and critique. That's part of why I was attracted to YouTube, as opposed to I had a lot of appreciation for what Rod Dreher was doing on his blog, but I saw the limitations of a blog, and I wanted something a little bit more conversational, let's say, than a blog. And so when I was, even before Jordan Peterson, when I was thinking, what could I do? What could YouTube do? Those ideas were rolling around in my head. So could the meaning crisis abate with a return to prosperity? We've got a lot of prosperity. I mean, I really enjoyed Douthat's book on decadence, and I think he's right with a lot of points, but and Peterson is right about capitalism and prosperity in the world, but our definition of prosperity tends to be, see, the filters that we use to judge are also our filters. And so we are in many ways comparing ourselves to pre-industrial revolution humanity. And I bump into these things all the time when I am working through biblical texts, because, clothing, for example, I have the amount of clothing that each of us possess as compared to someone living 2,000 years ago is just dramatic. When in the Bible we read someone rending their clothing, that was a huge deal. I could sit here, and nobody wants me to do it, I could just tear my shirt if I wanted to. Not that easily, because this is a pretty strong fabric, and our fabrics are good, and our stitches are good. But so if I rend my clothing, the buttons would pop off. And that would look like sort of a dramatic thing. But then I'd just go home and put on a different shirt, because I've got dozens of shirts. And I'm not a clothing guy. I mean, if you watch my video, I'm not a clothing guy. So clothing for me is just kind of something I got to wear. And the fact that, way back in my childhood, I kind of got it, socialized to, well, you should wear different clothing. You don't wear the same thing every day. I'd be fine wearing the same thing every day. When other people get up, they're like, what do I feel like wearing today? I never have that thought. I just get up and put something on. So we are swimming in clothing. In fact, in North America, we give our clothing to Goodwill or Salvation Army, and they can't even use it all. So it gets bundled up and sent overseas, which made for some really hilarious times in Haitian churches. Sometimes you'd see somebody wearing a Playboy t-shirt, and they'd be a very strict Christian who thought that lipstick and makeup on a woman was of the devil, and they're wearing a Playboy t-shirt. And it's like, but of course it's a cultural filter that they're just not paying any attention to. So in other words, we are swimming with stuff thanks to the Industrial Revolution. And a big part of poverty is stuff. It's food. But look at our discontents right now. I have a very good friend who is, one of the things that he showed up at my house with a whole box of food because basically he decided that, all this homeless problem, I'm going to do a thing that will feed the homeless. Should have asked me, because I have probably way more experience with the homeless than he does. I deal with the homeless all the time. Food is not high on their salience hierarchy. Where can I get my next beer? Where can I get my next hit of my favorite drug? That's high on their salience hierarchy. Can I find a space where I have a decent amount of shelter and no one will bother me, so I can, let's imagine the Ring is the drug and we just sit there in our little corner surrounded. There's a homeless guy in the back that his pile of trash around him is sort of like Smog's gold, but it's all trash. And his shit is all right there. And all he is living his life is just his drug, his drug, his drug, his drug. And I've been watching him do this for years. And I talked to him and, yeah, I really gotta, oh, okay. Are you going to do anything about it? No. Okay. So now if you scale that up, I often think that today's revolutionaries are, they're nothing compared to ancient revolutionaries. Why? Because, I demand an end to the system. Just turn off their cell phone coverage and they'll demand to have the system back. So,
and it may actually help with.
And so civil war, really? Americans really like their systems. That's why they keep voting for system maintenance. And, Trump, the big disruptor that he was, the light stayed on. And comparing this to the kind of disruptions that we lived with regularly in the third world, when they did protesters have gone to trying to, stop interstate highways because that's the only way they can get attention. In the Dominican Republic, they'd have huelgas, and sometimes you see here that people try to import that idea here, but Americans are so in love with what they're used to and have so much of it. Gosh, you mean I can't get my favorite brand of whatever food? It's a crisis. I don't know that things are going to descend into civil war. I think people would end the war just to make sure that the grocery store had what they wanted in their particular brands, of which we have dozens. So I don't know. I could be wrong. Are we made better through the process of boom apocalypse cycles? Oh, that's a big question. Because you have to, who's we, what's better? And there's always these cycles we go through. It's just that we're going through these cycles, so many different kinds of cycles. This morning, Rick was talking to me about a computer game. And again, I'm just amazed at the creativity and then also all of the fast-moving communities that surround computer games, and we just cycle it up and up and up. We'll probably have more disturbance if they shut down World of Warcraft, except for the fact that there are how many other dozen computer game universes that would rush in to fill the gap. So the world has changed, and our view of its change is very small, just like we are. So great questions. All right, Chad the Alcoholic. Not much of a question here, but I want to thank you. Unfortunately, I have only words at the moment to do so. March 4th, 2021, I sent you an email in desperation and resentment looking for guidance, trying to find and understand Christ. I don't know if you remember this. I've not been able to express to you how grateful I am for your earnestness. Well, it's very sweet. Not long ago, you responded to my email and my coming to the Discord server, and how much to my surprise, everything in my heart and understanding of God has turned on its head, or right side up, if you will. My wife and I have been married for 6 months, had been married for 6 months at that point, and we are now coming up on our first anniversary. We have found a small church to call home where we can be useful and part of a community in addition to our 12-step fellowship. That's wonderful. We have just put an offer on a house and it was accepted, closing November. I've had a few struggles with self since being captured by Christ, but the Bridges of Meaning community was guided me in many ways. Anyway, I know I'm a bit of a joker. We love you. We love that about you, Chad. From time to time around here, and I want you to know how deeply grateful my family and I are for the love of Christ and for your expression of that love. God bless you, Paul. That's very sweet, Chad. Thank you very much. Well, you're a big asset to this community, not only the Discord server, but some of the videos that you've made and your presence here. So I'm sorry we haven't done a convo yet. It'll come. I'm sure it'll come. But thank you for this note. The notes like this, it sounds so Peterson-esque, I know, but notes like this are, there are days that I just think, what am I doing? This is the craziest thing I could do. I sit here and I talk into this computer and I send out these videos and I talk about all kinds of crazy stuff. And maybe it's all just foolishness, but I appreciate it, Chad. So, and yeah, I pray that the blessings will continue. There will be struggles. I know there will be. There always are, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Good for you. Shane, the double Gentile. Does that mean you were circumcised twice? No, uncircumcised twice. J.R.R. Tolkien wanted Lord of the Rings to serve as an inspiring mythology for England. While people love Lord of the Rings, they generally don't use it as mythology. Compare Lord of the Rings to the Book of Mormon. While Lord of the Rings is better as literature, the Book of Mormon is claimed to be true history and used as a source of meaning for millions of people. I love this comment because you are right. And it has a lot to do with, so Barfield sort of gives a really interesting mapping, but that mapping goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. You get to someone recently sent me a Andrew Clavin video where he quotes Barfield, which was delightful. And he was reading Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances. And you can ask the question, is a rainbow there? And obviously, with respect to a rainbow, everything depends on, well, where's it raining? Is there moisture in the air? Is the sun out at the same time? And where the observer is standing. And, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So, and if you've ever tried to work on locating the end of the rainbow, well, that gets interesting, doesn't it? So the Lord of the Rings is sort of the same thing. Because it's fantasy, I remember when I first read Lord of the Rings, I was in junior high. And boy, I loved it. And then in high school, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons. And in some ways, Dungeons and Dragons is sort of a riff on Lord of the Rings. And of course, then there was the Dungeons and Dragons scare that this is opening the door to satanic stuff, yada, yada, yada. But this aspect of the claim of historicity is so vital to Christianity and all of the issues that we're talking about. Now, I suspect Mormonism, it's been an astoundingly successful religion, but part of its difficulty is that it came of age in a time where there is a ton of documentation. And so, it's hardly a secret that there's not a shred of physical evidence to support any of the claims of the Book of Mormon. Whereas with the Bible, it's also older, and so it leads to all of the kinds of discussions that you can hear, like in my favorite podcast, The Rest is History. Did it really happen? And when a modernist asks that, most modernists don't have any understanding of what they're actually asking. It's like asking the rainbow, is the rainbow really there? Well, you can capture it in a picture. Okay, but you can capture a lot of things in pictures that, if you take a picture of a cloud that you see a bunny in the sky, you ask, is the bunny really there? Well, what's a bunny? And of course, it's into this maelstrom that Peugeot steps in and says Santa Claus is real, or Uncle Sam is real. Well, is Uncle Sam really there? He's there enough to pay taxes to and to take your sons to killing fields in Europe or Asia. And this is why modernity is ending. So the story of the book Lord of the Rings is not yet over. We'll see what happens. So let's say John Vervaeke and company come up with a solution to give meaning to everyone affected by the meaning crisis. Can they get people to believe and implement it without embedding it in a narrative and presenting it as true history or direct revelation from God? This has been my question about his project all along. Because there's a better. And part of what I think we're also dealing with is I've been struggling to figure out how to talk about this stuff now for years as I've made videos. And so I feel, why do I make so many videos? It's stupid for me to make videos if I want to have a big YouTube channel. I look at the analytics, and I know if I would just ask Mark. Mark knows this too. And I regularly get people just asking, I got to finish my sentences. I got to slow down and finish my sentences. What am I talking about? If I were to make fewer videos, choose my words more carefully, tailor my illustrations more effectively, I could have a better YouTube channel. Well, what do I mean better? It depends what the YouTube channel is for. If my goal was to create a bigger YouTube channel and have more viewers, well, you could do like Ben Shapiro or political YouTubers or Scott Adams. Now, I'm not saying I could do it with the skill that Ben Shapiro or Scott Adams do. I'm not saying that, but there's something to the topic that they are dealing with. Same with lots of religious groups. That isn't the point. I use my YouTube channel for talking. You know, I got home yesterday, and when I get home and my wife's home and we don't have any kids living in the house, I have one daughter that's kind of in and out there because she's got a boyfriend, and that's the way it goes with young adults. But my wife and I are now spending more time alone together than we have for over 30 years when our first child was born. So when we get home from work, my wife tells me about her day, talks about stuff at work, yada, yada, yada. And as a husband, you put in your time listening and engaging in that. I spend a lot of time talking to you. Why do I do this? I do this because I need to try to find the language to say what it's sort of to say what I don't know yet. I'm trying to finish my sentences. It's sort of, you are sort of a third hemisphere of my brain. That's what you've become for me. And it's a third hemisphere that's helping again, these are Ian McGilchrist's theological constructs. My left brain and my right brain come together. Because what your comment and your question proposed, Shane, is exactly this. In some ways, the physical world around us is also another hemisphere of our knowing. And so we engage with it in some ways analogously to the ways that our hemispheres engage with each other. So what happened physically is important, but it's only half the story. Now, I already recorded a commentary video on Keith Wood's wokeism and our transhumanist future. And this morning I was planning out a video following that where I deal with what I call, Vervaeke talks about ending the two worlds mythology. And in many ways, what Vervaeke and Peugeot, what they have in common is they are trying to undo the enormous impact of Cartesian dualism on our collective thinking. They are trying to bring the world together. And Peugeot is trying to bring the world together from above. And Vervaeke is trying to bring the world together from below. And so it's kind of good that they talk to each other because they sort of meet in the middle. And that's why there's this constant conversation between them with emanation and emergence, even though both Peugeot and Vervaeke have significant appreciation for the other side. Vervaeke has significant appreciation for emanation, and Peugeot has significant appreciation for emergence. They both understand and are working on this, okay? So the video that I'm working on today, we'll see if there are a lot of videos that get fertilized, let's say, but not all come to terminal gestation or come to the end, the fruitful gestation. You have the upper and the lower registers, and this is sort of maps onto two worlds mythology that Vervaeke wants us to get away from. But I don't think that two worlds mythology is going anywhere because I think it's fundamental, seeded in some ways by the two hemispheres, at least the conceptual hemispheres that Ian McGilchrist talks about. That you must always have heaven and earth, and you must always have spirit and flesh, and you must always have mind and matter, and you must always have now and always, and you must always have chronos and kairos. That these dualities, and again, this gets into consciousness, these dualities are always with us. And so part of what, the Enlightenment and modernity put on our plate is you can't ignore the lower register. To ignore the lower register is to no longer be human. And we are human beings. And the Hebrew, we are a nephesh. We are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. But like Peugeot talks about in his Immanence and Transcendence video recently, we can't just talk about these things as separate. And so what you see in the Bible is all of this bothness going on. So this is, and again, figuring out how to talk about this is why I make so much video, because I want to know it. And in a sense, I can't capture it in my left brain until my right brain, I mean, they just keep going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so that, and you all are my third hemisphere. And this is what we're doing. This is our collective cognition. And what you put your finger on here, Shane, is one of the ways into this. And that's why I mean, Carl in the comments hates, I mean, PVK still doesn't get it. Oh, okay, well, maybe Carl has all the answers and I don't. If I thought that, I'd shut up, or I'd try to understand Carl better, and maybe Carl and I should do another conversation. But this is a problem that in many ways sent me to Peterson, because it maps onto the science versus religion conflict. It maps onto the history versus record conflict, because again, every record of what modernists call a historical event is a reduction involving relevance realization. And that's why stories are massive compression engines. I had a classis meeting this week, and we had an Article 17. What does that mean? Article 17 is when there is a separation between a church and its minister. And we have church order articles to process that as a community. And we got an Article 17 request from the church in Fresno from its minister. And most of us didn't know that had happened because we hadn't had a classis meeting in 6 months. We only have them every 6 months. What we needed was a story, because the story compresses an enormous situation of a church and a pastor down into something. We needed parabolic knowledge that we could all sort of connect into our mapped world and say, oh, okay, this is okay, and this isn't okay. It is okay because by virtue of the long story of the church, that both the church and the pastor came to a realization that they weren't right for each other. That's okay. That happens. And then classis, after some deliberation, said, good, Article 17, they can both go their own way and continue their stories without any classical intervention. If we had had a story that, well, there was an Article 17 because pastor did something, what did pastor do? Ooh, he slept with the organist. Oh, now suddenly we're into Article 84 and 86 where there's discipline. Or the pastor left because the pastor was deficient in some relational skills, or was suffering from some, was preaching heresy. Well, then suddenly we have supervision before the pastor can take a call again. We have all of this stuff, and we need a story to sort of take it in. That's why story and narrative are so foundational. And this, again, is why, I love John and I wish him well. And I'm fascinated by his project, but it's like trying to invent a new religion. And now I understand that he's not using religion literally, but yeah, despite our meaning crisis, we have found ways of affording meaning in many, many in many, many ways, such as computer games. Computer games are meaning generators. But we also know that they're not, humanity does not live on gaming alone. Gaming, you can game, but this is where you get into this question of what on earth is a good life? Oh, wow, that is so hard to conceptualize. What is peace? What is shalom? So, yeah, Shane, it's a great question. It's a great question. Oh boy, here I thought we'd have, let's do end of questions. There's no, I will be gone next week, Friday morning. So no Discord Q&A next week, Friday. I have to go to Southern California and do a synodical deputy thing. And I'm going to spend the night at John Van Donk's house. And John Van Donk is always scheming. And there are schemers around John who are scheming. And so I'm going to have an evening of scheming. So that's what I'll be doing next week. And so then I'll get back Friday. I'll get back to Sacramento Friday morning, and then I'll got to get all my other stuff done because I still do have my day job here at Livingstone's Church. All right. Night, Adam. Flashcoms 497. Hi, Paul. I was watching your video on the boy crisis a few days ago and have been wrestling with these problems for a while. Whatever half solutions I might come up with, I have tried to consider exactly the situation with women you have described. What do you do with the 30 or 40 something career woman who has allowed men to abstain from any commitment with her? Okay, let me say a couple of things first. And all of this goes back in some ways to Gavin's question about judging. Some of the language and cultural habits of today that sort of the Jordan Peterson community can sort of easily start shellacking about our culture war, there's some validity to them. Men don't know women and women don't know men. And it seems that despite thousands of years of trying to understand each other, we regularly fail. And, I go find that Family Feud story of what would 100 married men do for sex? I mean, it's just classic men and women. And I know this because I'm married to a woman and we bump into this all the time. And I can articulate listening to a woman what I should and shouldn't do, but the good that I would do, I don't do. So I think, and I get this from a friend of mine, I think you're exactly right. There are going to be a generation of 30 and 40 something career women, and they're already here, but their numbers are going to grow, who want a fruitful, satisfying, enduring relationship with a man, and they want biological children. And it's not going to happen. The show started to annoy my wife, and so I stopped watching it. But there's a movie on Paramount Plus about some coupon clippers who started basically getting coupons from the Mexican printing house that was printing the coupons for these major corporations and getting rich doing it. It's sort of a Breaking Bad, but with coupons instead of meth. And it's based on a true story, whatever that means. Back to Shane's point. And one of the women, she did this because She and her husband tried in vitro and racked up huge bills trying in vitro fertilization, and she was never able to get pregnant. And we might say, well, we've got all this technology. Maybe you'll get 1 or 2 kids out if you start late, but maybe not more than that. And, even though men continue to produce sperm, there's now studies that suggest that, hey, guess what? The sperm we produce when we're younger is in some ways better than the old sperm. And the women don't produce any more eggs, and so their eggs get old. So you have freezing eggs, and there's some biological realities that we are not quickly or easily going to get around. And at least one of my friends believes there's going to be a lot of anger in our culture when those 30, 40, and 50-year-old career women realize that this world will not produce for them some of the dreams that they had. Now, to be a human being in this world means to be disappointed. Not all of your dreams will be fulfilled. They never are. But this is a really big one, and it's a really foundational one, and it's a super consequential one. And now, it's also the case that there's a lot of women out there that have produced plenty of children and are not doing well in terms of marriage and family. And so there's that too. So it's it's also the case that it is a deeply difficult, but also satisfying thing for both men and women to marry. I mean, this isn't Chad's answer. To marry and produce children and raise those children. I know that because I've been blessed with 5 children. I never thought I'd have 5 children. My parents had 3 kids. My grandparents on both sides had 3 kids. I always just thought 3 was the number of kids that you have. Well, we wound up having 5. I won't go into the reasons. My wife at the time probably would have liked to have had more. 5 kids costs a lot. But there are few things in my life more meaningful to me than my children. But I know others for whom their relationships with their children is a source of great disappointment, discomfort, suffering. So, and as a culture, I think we're only half awake to this sometimes. Sometimes we idolize it and idolatrize it, but sometimes we're not. So what do you do? I don't do anything. They're going to do. I'm talking about it, and I want to give a little bit of warning to people and say, well, I want to. So again, this mantra that I've made many times, and many of you have heard it because I've seen it in the comments. A healthy, good culture affords wisdom to people who have not had the biological age or the cultural experience to afford that wisdom. That's what culture is for. That's why human beings are so powerful. That's why we're not just genetic or epigenetic, we're cultural. Culture is here to provide wisdom towards shalom. Why should it surprise us that our commercial culture that has developed one of the most powerful influence engines known to humanity, this commercial industrial complex, colonizes women against their better interest? Does so with men too. Does so with all of us. There are principalities and powers at work. And each of us has to make decisions about how to navigate our lives. Not everyone should marry. Not everyone should reproduce. But for many of us, it's a gift from God. But like many of God's more powerful gifts, to receive a powerful gift means to learn how to use it for the welfare of others. And that's what this is. So women in their 20s, there's almost none of you out there listening to me. I know, I look at the metrics. Most of the people who listen to my channel are men, 75% at least on YouTube. And most of them are between 30 and 50. But women in their 20s shouldn't waste their 20s. And so much of what's happening in this culture right now is not blessing them. And that's sad. And I'm not trying to say that the 1950s culture was somehow a heyday. It's interesting why we think it was, because it was some of the hottest years of the Cold War, and it was the Korean War. But this is really, really hard and really, really important that we try to get right. So it's understandable that some of our conversations that are most salient to us surround it. I would probably suggest that women in their 20s don't waste their 20s. You can go to YouTube and Google that. There's a good TED Talk about it. Don't waste your 20s. You don't get that many decades in life. And already in your 30s, you're not what you were in your 20s. And your 40s, you're not either in some respects. By your 50s, hopefully you've gained some wisdom, and it's your time to share back to younger generations what you've learned. How does one integrate her into a community? Women, in my experience, do better than men often with respect to entering into community. Not always, but women's Bible studies at church, those are hardy little beasts. They don't die easily. Men and women are so different. Men are tougher to manage, to get into certain kinds of communities than women. I'll look at a football game. It's mostly men. Men and women differentiate what they watch, what they're interested in. Women are more relational in a certain way. Men focus on things. Women focus on people. I mean, all this stuff. We know all this stuff. But make spaces for women and let them do their thing. But also make spaces for men and let them do their thing. How does one integrate her into a community? Well, women will get into community. And I'll tell you, so my church is mostly women because it's older and it's a church. A lot of what I have to do is make sure these women don't get into spirals of bickering or fighting over small things. Those are usually the relational things I have to deal with at church because they're complex. And you see it all throughout life. There's this great Amy Schumer, is that her name? She's a comic. She has this great little video about basically verbal combat between men and women. It's hilarious because these dudes, I mean, we're just dumb as rocks and simple sometimes. And women are, especially young women and young men, when it comes to verbal combat, because women have perfected the art of the reputational takedown, and men are so clumsy. Yeah. That's why marriage between opposite sex is so fruitful on so many different levels. Men get to learn women and women get to learn men. We need each other. I can't help but have the expectation of a large feeling of betrayal, which really won't be unfounded, welling up among these women. Yeah. You can blame men for that if you want to, but blame is so often, if it's instinctive to blame, but if you don't do it well, it's fruitless. Blame only works well if, on one hand, it doesn't yield to bitterness, which is fruitless, and you can get specific about the blame, because that's, in a sense, relevance realization. What exactly is to blame? Well, I am. You have to include yourself. And then if you find other factors, but the culture is to blame. Okay, what are you going to do with the culture? It's something that we all create together. And so the little places where we have agency in it, use that agency to create a better culture. I'm not sure what sort of reaction may occur on a larger political scale, but the smaller scale issue is one that certainly seems novel and potentially dangerous. Yeah. Especially if women cannot forego present pleasure in service of arduous good. Yeah. What advice would you have for young men of about 20 regarding preparing for this future? I mean, of course, the ones who are thinking about it and not simply enjoying the present pleasures. Advice isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Because advice, well, read the book of Proverbs. There's a lot of advice in the book of Proverbs, and it's good advice. I think in many ways, a lot of the culture that we have been disposing of since the Cultural Revolution had some achievements in it that we have disposed of at our peril. And we are now facing the consequences for them. However, that culture was not perfect either. And some of the reasons it was critiqued and aspects dismantled were because of issues within it. I'm a Calvinist. I believe in total depravity. This world is not perfect and won't be until we receive the divine intervention we need. But there has been divine intervention, and we should make use of that. So part of what's really interesting about the Bible is that you're really hard-pressed to find a narrative of ideal family life. In some ways, the Bible shows you how many different ways to not do family. The problem is that hard. Yeah, I did that video on the sex lives of the patriarchs. It's a mess. I mean, you read the book of Genesis, it's a mess. But you get beyond the book of Genesis. You get to David and Solomon, and there's often very little said about it. Jesus, to the best of our knowledge, was single. Paul, to the best of our knowledge, was single. This stuff is really, really hard, and it isn't getting easier. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And part of what's so difficult about these things is that they are so enduring, in that, like the debate between marry young or marry old later. Marry young. Okay. You'll have better shot at producing a nice sized family. You'll grow in wisdom together. If you can keep the marriage together over a long term, you can learn registers of love that can only be found in the combination of suffering and commitment. That being said, how much wisdom do you have when you're in your early 20s about mate selection? Well, probably a lot of biological stuff. I there's a joke about that. I getting all Mark Driscoll-y talking about my smoking hot wife. My wife is smoking hot, and in her 20s. I mean, first time I saw her, and this is common now. And so there's some individuality to it. This is a common story you hear among people. I saw her across the room and I knew she would be my wife. There's a lot of biology going on in there. There's a lot of psychology. But you probably have chosen someone that is addressing some deep needs. And back when families were making decisions about spouses, those parents had, if they were wise and loving, had some wisdom that they could pour into a mate selection based on decades of marriage themselves. Letting kids decide this? Many ancient cultures would say, are you out of your mind? But off we go. And so, I knew when I made these comments about young marry early versus marry late, I would hear from a number of people, which I did, that said, I married young and it was a disaster. I married the wrong person. And again, this is where advice is so difficult, because some people do marry the wrong people. There are people that you should not marry, and you do. And it's a disaster. And divorce is better than staying together. And then there are people that you do marry the wrong people, but part of the grace is making it work and doing all the learning that suffering and commitment can afford. See, Americans want marriage because it's supposed to yield happiness and meaning and personal aggrandizement and self-fulfillment. That's a bunch of crap. A good marriage should make you a better person, but you almost never become a better person without suffering. And not all marriages should be kept. Singleness can do the same thing. So I had an uncle who, my aunt died of colon cancer, and my aunt, when they were young, everybody wanted to be his girlfriend, and she was hot, and so everyone wanted to be her boyfriend, and they were raised in a Christian community, so premarital sex was forbidden, and so you get married young. And so they married young, and they had a good marriage, and they had 2 lovely children. And then my aunt died of colon cancer in her 60s. And my mother asks her brother-in-law, so what are you going to do? You going to remarry? He said, I'd rather be lonely than miserable. He wasn't dumb. He understood full well that, especially a guy at 60 years old like him, there's a long line of 50, 60 something women that would have loved to marry him. He had been through marriage. He understood that marriage is a big deal. Do I really want to go through this? Marriage can bring tremendous joy and tremendous suffering. Joy that it's not easy to find other places, but suffering like in some ways no other suffering in the world. So singleness is a real option. Paul talks about it. Jesus was, kept it, to the best of our knowledge, a celibate single. Are there struggles in that? Yeah, there are always struggles. So I would say, you're looking for advice, seek out wisdom. Book of Proverbs. Find wise people to listen to. If you get attracted to someone and they're attracted to you, and you start getting interested in each other and you start dating, date with friends and ask your friends what they think of your new girlfriend. And try to look for someone who is also trying to gain in wisdom. And I'm a Christian minister, so it shouldn't come as a surprise. Do so in the context of a church. Because if you're a Christian, don't be unequally yoked. Now, a warning. Just because you're married to a Christian doesn't mean that the person that you're with will stay in the faith. And then you're going to have to make decisions. So there's no magic bullet here, and there are a lot of resources out there, probably more than when, in some ways, a lack of culture a lack of cultural wisdom produces more explicit wisdom, because we have to. But that all has to be, anything that comes into the world now has to be pattern tested through time. So if you're a young man, and part of what's been going on in our culture is that people are having sex too soon in a relationship, and they don't understand the psychological consequences of sex. Sex bonds you to that other person. Are you sure you want to be emotionally attached to this other person? Now, with birth control, there's less of a possibility of an unmarried pregnancy. But even if you're having fruitless sexual activity with another person, you're bonding your life to them. So this is all hard stuff, but it's important stuff. So, every time I make a video on this kind of thing, part of me wants to look for a bomb shelter to hide in, because I know some people aren't going to like what I'm doing, and I know I'm going to get stuff wrong, and I know any advice that you give will not work for somebody. So, but it's a vitally important thing. Julian, how many questions we got? Okay. Paul, you've often talked about the poor and homeless you interact with. You often seem to be pushing back against the very romantic views of poverty and homelessness that some of us in the culture have. What would you make of Jesus' words about the kingdom of God coming to the poor? That he fills them with good things while leaving the rich hungry. Do you spiritualize that? I think in the spiritual sense is obviously true. Or have you caught glimpses of the kingdom among the poor and the homeless you minister to? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So my father and I have had the privilege of doing a lot of ministry and living in community with a lot of African Americans. It's not a secret that when it comes to the history of African Americans in the United States, that they have been the victims of a ton of racism, a ton of discrimination. They were hauled here in chains. They were brutalized for centuries. When they were emancipated, you can't just undo the culture that had gone around it. Yet, I have seldom been in communities of more joy and fun than in Black culture. I loved Glenn Lowry's observation when in his conversation with Cornel West that a lot of these silly tropes about powerless Blackness in our culture are just stupid. African American influence on American culture is deep, profound, pervasive. Have African Americans been victimized, that they haven't received the financial fruit of many of their cultural offerings? Absolutely. But American culture would not be what it is without the astounding contribution of the descendants of slaves in this country. When I worked in the Dominican Republic, same thing. How do all these Africans get in the Caribbean? They're brought there as slaves to work on sugar plantations, because sugar was the great drug, still is. Canadian work teams would come down to build a little church or build a little house. And they'd always say, these people are so happy and they have nothing. Yeah, part of that is because of some of the lies that we've been told about material prosperity and happiness. Part of it is because these people were hospitable and welcoming and really liked having a group of rich Canadians come down and improve their material prospects dramatically in a very short order. And they wanted to build reputation with Canadians because, gosh, if they could get a visa to Canada or the United States, that would change the trajectory of their families completely. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But that's right. To romanticize the poor is stupid, because there's nothing romantic about being poor, or there's very little. But what is really, what those of us who are drowning in affluence are really suffering from is the deceit of wealth, which the Bible also talks about. Because our affluence and our wealth are the source of many of our troubles, just like poverty is the source of other troubles. I had once, so again, for years, my friend slept against my door. And I would, for years, I worked evenings because I was homeschooling during the mornings. Then my wife was teaching in a public school during the morning and early afternoon. She would come home and I would go here to church, and I would work afternoon and evening because you'd have evening meetings as a pastor. And so it wasn't a bad split. And so I'd be working on sermons 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. Here in the middle of winter, which in Sacramento doesn't usually involve snow, but it can be rain and cold. And I sometimes when I would get into my bed at night, I would feel a degree of longing to be with my homeless friends that were shivering under the eaves of this church. And I thought to myself, what if I just, my wife would, I don't know what she would on earth she would think if I'd said this, but honey, I'm going to go sleep against my office door at church. Maybe after a half hour, I'd say, what am I doing? I have a warm bed at home with a lovely wife. Why don't I go back inside? Some of my friends who live on the street know things I will never know. And every now and then I get glimpses of it. The material prosperity that I have surrounded myself and that has put pounds on my body that I should lose has limited me and corrupted me and made me unhappy in ways that I will never know. Life is so mysterious that, when Jesus says the most outrageous things, like he takes these Beatitudes, which you can find in the Psalms, and he reverses them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn. Why? What's so blessed about mourning? They will be comforted. And in a way, comfort after mourning is far sweeter than constant affluence and pleasure. We're so strange that way. And that's why suffering can produce a joy that never having suffered can never match. So, yeah. No, that's right. And the Anabaptists know this. I did a video on Anabaptists. The Anabaptists know this. What an amazing part of the Christian tradition. Okay, I'm running out of time. I got to keep moving. Hi, Paul. JP Biggs. I've really appreciated the firm and gentle hand you've brought to the conversation around marriage equality. I came into listening to the conversation with a very similar convictions as yours. Recently, though, a close friend and co-laborer in the faith call him Eric, has put a spotlight on an aspect of the issue that I hadn't considered. Eric and I would share the same traditional convictions regarding gender and sexuality, let's say. But recently, Eric's been engaged to a young woman who's, let's say, something like a new believer. Call her Sarah. She happens to have a great number of LGBTQ friends, and Eric has found himself being perhaps the only real witness in their lives. He has been deeply appreciative of how our church has made Sarah feel like she belongs in a welcoming faith family, where she'd gotten the opposite impression before. For us, it was never a question whether she belonged or not. We're all lost sheep, of course. I too am thankful for my church's heart in this matter. Eric has come to feel conflicted with how the traditionalist belief in sexuality informs how we welcome the LGBT lost. If you call them lost, they're not going to feel good about that either. We believe that sexuality in our modern context has become conflated with one's identity. This must be shed, and in its place, identity in Christ must reign. But this, of course, is the case for any single lost sheep coming into the fold. We all bear with us idolatrous identities that we must die to and replace with one in Christ. It seems, though, that most of us are not expected or made to feel the expectation that we must come to this conclusion, before stepping into the fold. Someone like Sarah was treated with belonging before belief. She heard something like, "Come follow Jesus with us and we will walk with you and you will learn to die to yourself." It seems like in many cases, the same isn't the true of how we welcome those who are LGBT, same-sex attracted, etc. Follow Jesus, you have come to die to yourself and we will walk with you. My question for you is this: how can the church hold fast to her convictions and be a witness to the world in a light of and about these convictions while being sure that the lost hear you belong here? You've articulated this masterfully. And even though many of my colleagues will not listen to this answer because they don't have time, I go to my classes meeting and a few people make comments about, "I've been listening to your podcast or to your videos." And other people say, "I don't have time to listen to you." God bless you. My wife doesn't either, nor interest. So this is the question that I struggle with, that my church planting colleagues struggle with. And I have, I talked about you being my third hemisphere. Part of the reason I talk about church and LGBT stuff is because I am looking to answer the same questions you are. And I don't have the answers. And in many ways, like I've said about other things, the answer won't come in verbal form. The answer will come in practice. The answer will come in community. And so what happens in a lot of our church plants is that because of this dynamic, they pretty much swallow their tongue with respect to these issues. And I've done the same thing. We don't preach about this. We don't talk about this. And what this means is that into our church come people on both sides of this debate. And then an issue arises. Maybe someone looks up the denominational website and says, "Hey, wait a minute." Or someone goes to a broader assembly like a classis or a synod and hears some things and they're like, "Do we believe this? Is this who we are? I don't know if I can be a part of this." So even that, Tim Keller called it not forefronting. Even, and Redeemer Press, PCA is pretty conservative, and Tim Keller has had to deal with this, obviously. And so a church like City Church San Francisco, that was, Scott Sherman was a Tim Keller church planter in the Village before he and Fred Harrell and moved out to California and planted City Church San Francisco. And they were a PCA church, and then they joined the Reformed Church of America. That's when I got to know them. And then a few years ago, they decided to take a more open and affirming stance, and they lost half their church. That's what usually happens. Either you make an affirming stance and you lose half your church, or you have a test case that comes to your church, and suddenly everybody realizes that pastor isn't affirming, not in the way the culture is. So then you lose the other half of your church. So then I play around with ecclesiology, and that's difficult because I'm in a denomination. It's a little bit easier if you're non-denominational, but if you're non-denominational, you're subject to all kinds of other issues, not subject to accountability. So a friend of mine who's been on the channel, Rod Hugan, and some of you know him, at the Village, which is kind of half in the CRC and half not in the CRC, they do membership yearly. And what they mean is, here's what we believe. You see what we practice. Are you able to commit to this for another year? Now, this gives some of the people a chance to be in and out. And part of the way church membership works is designed to mitigate some of these things. So there are people that come to Living Stones that aren't members. And some of them aren't members because they know Christian Reformed Church baptizes babies. Some aren't members because Christian Reformed Church lets women be elders, and there are women elders at Living Stones. Some aren't members because Christian Reformed Church is traditionalist with respect to marriage, but yet they participate in the community. What's amazing is that certain traditions, like, say, the Roman Catholics, who have, in theory, a very vigorous set of church dogmas around such things. Andrew Sullivan considers himself Catholic. Does he receive the Mass? Now, if anybody hasn't caught my conversation today, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This conversation starts out slow, but that's a powerful conversation. It's only 48 minutes long. But Anne tells a story about her father. And what's true about why I love these conversations and these stories is because, as you know, with my answer to Shane's thing, these are historical. This man lived. This man was her father. So I'm not going to spoil the story. Watch the conversation. It's powerful. And she told me she hadn't really shared that. Not many people know that story. So glad she shared it. We had another woman on the channel. I won't say her name because, we don't want people getting doxxed, but it's a conversation I had on the channel that most of you watched. And, this woman whose husband cheated on her, divorced her, and she's a young, attractive woman that if she wanted to find a man, she'd have no problem. She's holding out hope for her marriage, even though her husband is now married to the woman that he cheated on her with. In some ways, for people for whom this culture has made super reactive, I can't be a part of a group that blank. Okay. All of us have those lines. Those lines are good to have. part of what I try to model on this channel is productive conversations with people with whom we differ. Some of those differences are substantial. Could I, now it's a little different because I don't finish my sentences. There's 3 I didn't finish. Could I be a member of an affirming denomination? Could I be a member of the Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA? That depends. Could I be an ordained minister in the PCUSA? That depends. About 15 years ago, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to be a minister in a mainline church because they don't enforce anything. Well, actually, they do. But it's not, there's an interesting situation of a Korean church. I think they're United Methodist, where the Koreans are obviously conservative on these things. And they've got a very liberal progressive bishop who's basically trying to drive out, who's not in alignment with the official church teaching, who's trying to drive out the pastor who is in alignment with the official church teaching. I mean, there's a dysfunctional situation. But Jesus comes into this world, and by the incarnation becomes subject. This is part of the reason I think Christianity can't give up the divinity of Christ, because the story just doesn't work as well without it. Jesus comes into this world, the Son of God, and is subject to the leadership at Bethlehem, the leadership at Nazareth, the synagogue leadership to Capernaum, the religious authorities within his ethno-cultural religious group, the Roman authorities, all of the customs and cultures and habits that had developed. This is God. This is a holy God. The entire tension of, I'm about to sneeze. Sorry about that. The entire tension of the desert wanderings and the story of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures is, can a holy God live in the midst of an unholy people? The tabernacle is a fabric containment unit to try to keep God from wiping out the people. It's as if they had a neutron bomb in a tent that they traveled around with. And every now and then, some of it goes off and people die. That's the God of Israel. And that God, I mean, again, when Sam says, I don't believe in the Trinity, and when Jacob says, I really don't believe in the Trinity, I get it. That God that is the neutron bomb comes as an infant to a virgin into our world. John the Baptist, who is saying the axe is laid to the root of the tree. I've been reading Paul in Thessalonians. Paul keeps talking about this coming wrath. That's very, John the Baptist was talking about this coming wrath. Hebrew prophets are always talking about coming wrath. The concern that we might have about Chris Hedges and Matt Taibbi, that civil war might break out. That's coming wrath. Wrath does come. And there's no better way to say it than the wrath of God. That the God of this world would come and tolerate us. And part of why he was killed was his toleration. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. Now, part of our culture after 2,000 years says, oh, that toleration is so wonderful. Yeah, until you have to tolerate what you find intolerable. And so that could be an affirming church, or it could be a conservative church. God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. Be perfect like your Father in heaven. Get into these issues a little bit with, Tom Holland, part of why I like what he's doing is he flushes out these issues. To what degree is God karmic? To what degree is the God of the Hebrews and Jesus revealing an anti-karmic God, which I think is glimpsed at in the book of Job. So, and how do we institutionalize that in a church? Because that's the question. I've seen churches do it informally, sort of well. Can you institutionalize it? That's always the puzzle of the church, the problem of wineskins. So it's a great question. And many churches, like mine, like the church plants in Sacramento, are working really hard at it. But it's not unlike Thomas Jefferson and the light bulb. You try hundreds of things. The only problem is with Thomas Jefferson and a light bulb, he just burns through filaments and tries something else. These are people and relationships that we're trying things out on. And, so the PCA is, and, part of the reaction to this is, so some of the conservative groups are now saying things like, well, we're not going to have any clergy. We're not going to allow anyone in the clergy who is same-sex attracted. I don't think that's smart. Yeah, but they might flip. Yeah, they might flip. But your opposite set attracted clergy step out with fairly good regularity too. Let's not get too let's not make this the worst of all sins just because the culture is dealing badly with it. If there's grace for your heterosexual pastor's affair, then there's grace for your homosexual affair. And, just like with my question about women, I try to deal with this with individuals as adults. I just lay the cards on the table. I say, you know what? This is the Christian Reformed Church. This is where the church is at. This is my thinking. If you want to know what I think, here's 5 hours of video to watch. Have at it. Do you want to know long enough to listen to 5 hours? It's there for you. You probably don't. You're probably going to isolate me down to a binary yes or no. And on the basis of that, make your decision. Fair enough. Life is short. We need low resolution to make decisions. If you don't want to deal with a messy middle, stay away from me, because that's where I'm at. And I'm caught between loving my friends and neighbors for whom they've made their decision. Okay. That's what agency and humanity is. I just try to be honest as I can and love as best I can. So, but this thing, no, you're exactly right. I have a friend who is not a member of this church because he won't be a member of a church that is not affirming. Fair enough. Such a lovely Christian man. Supports this church financially. he's got two gay daughters and a gay son. I understand his position, but he knows mine, and we're still friends. So, yeah, great question. All right, last question of the day. Paul, I was a pastor for about 15 years, and I walked away from ministry in 2017 after I suffered a total emotional and mental breakdown. However, since then, I have done a lot of healing and I have grown. The start of this year, I heard Jesus speak to me for the first time in a long time. He told me he was going to revive the love of Jesus in my life, and that no longer loving him is where my heart had gone wrong. That day later on, I discovered with my wife that she had a brain tumor. That day later, I discovered with my wife that she had a brain tumor that was going to kill her if it was not removed. We elected to do the emergency surgery a week later. Through a series of miraculous circumstances, my wife has recovered and is doing quite well. However, there's always a however. The whole ordeal changed me radically. You are one of those people of light along my journey to restoration that I would always tune into for a dose of truth and a good conversation. So for that, I thank you. I now believe ministry was not something I could ever really leave. Since I could leave the paycheck, sure, I could leave the paycheck and the responsibilities, but to be honest, I desire to see others know Jesus as I now know him, and to live the abundant Christian life as I now live at the very first time, live it for the very first time, is so strong and getting stronger daily that I can barely contain it anymore. I ask that you pray for me, and if you have any advice moving forward, I'd be open to chat. 3 bowls of cake. I'll pray first. Lord, you know all things. You know this man and his wife, and I thank you, Lord, and praise you for the healing. Not only in his wife, but in this man's heart and his relationship with you. I thank you, Lord, for the rekindled zeal for sharing your love with others, because overflowing love is about the best thing any of us shallow vessels can be. At the same time, Lord, as this man well knows, ministry is complex. And we all think a journey and an adventure is a wonderful idea until we're there in the middle of it, and we're remembering our warm, cozy hobbit hole with cakes in the larder and fires in the hearth. So, Lord, be with this man and give him your spirit and bless his family and guide his steps. In whatever way you use him, Lord, I pray that you use him richly and that your overflowing love might flow through him into the lives of others, that they too may know your joy and they too may have your heart. Hear my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. I don't think I can give you advice. And then I go do it. Be wise. Be patient. The relationship between the ministry and the paycheck is often there. Don't muzzle the ox. But our first calling is to be his witness. And sometimes in the course of this life, we do so professionally. You don't find the word professionally in the Bible. So thank you for your story. Thank you for sharing it. Maybe we'll catch a randos conversation sometime. I'm way behind on my notes left in Discord. I'm way behind in Discord. I'm such a bad manager of so many things, and all of you deserve a much better pastor, which is why I keep telling you, you need a real life in-person pastor. And I can't be your pastor unless you're here at Living Stones, and then I should try better to be a better pastor. But Rick says yes, he's trying to be a better pastor. What does that say? God bless you. And I praise God for the recovery of your wife and that she's doing well. And I pray that that holds. And this is just, again, another example of the joy that can be found through pain and suffering. We can tell it in stories. It's hard to just sort of say outright. It sounds shallow outright and flat. So, no, let God guide you. Pray a lot. Listen to him. And that doesn't mean that doesn't mean it'll all go really, really well. But it does mean that God is good and can be trusted. And in many ways, that's the heart of the Christian faith. A Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. A Christian is someone who is willing to suffer because our Lord has suffered. And as the story attests, suffering will teach you things that most of us can't learn any other way, not in the same way. So that's probably as good a place to end this stream today. And so Rick's getting his headphones on, and thank you all for streaming and watching and listening. And thank you for those of you who came into the Discord and dropped in your questions. Again, no stream next week. I will be on an airplane flying back from Chino, California. So thank you all. God bless you. And may God bring his glory through you. All right, Rick, you can end transmission.